Sometimes the future is planted one seed at a time by hands that will never rest in the shade they create. That's what 38-year-old David Kim proved when he stood at the Family Feud podium with soil still under his fingernails from that morning's planting session and gave an answer that stopped Steve Harvey's heart and reminded an entire television studio that some people spend their lives building a world they'll never fully see, one tree at a time. David Kim had woken up at 5:30 a.m. that morning, just like every morning for the past 10 years, not because he had to, but because 50 seedlings were waiting in his garage, and early morning hours before summer heat were perfect for planting. By 7 a.m., he had planted 12 young oak trees along a barren highway stretch outside Philadelphia, part of his mission to plant 50,000 trees before his 40th birthday. He was currently at 49,847 trees, 153 to go. David's hands were permanently stained with dirt. His Honda Civic smelled like fertilizer and hope. The back seat was filled with shovels, watering cans, and saplings purchased with money most people would spend on vacations or entertainment. For the past decade, David had been living on 20% of his salary as a middle school science teacher, donating the other 80% to environmental organizations and tree planting initiatives. He lived in a small studio apartment, drove an old car, and hadn't bought new clothes in 3 years. But he could tell you the location of every single one of his 49,847 trees and calculate how much carbon they would absorb over their lifetimes. The math was simple to David. Climate change was happening faster than governments and corporations were responding. He couldn't control international policy or corporate practices, but he could plant trees. He could restore oxygen-producing, carbon-absorbing life to places where concrete and pollution had created dead zones. David's family thought he was obsessed. His friends thought he was extreme, but David had done the calculations. 50,000 trees would absorb approximately 1,100 tons of carbon dioxide over their lifetimes. That was equivalent to taking 240 cars off the road for a year, or offsetting the carbon footprint of 50 average American households. More importantly, those trees would provide oxygen, prevent soil erosion, create habitats for wildlife, and improve air quality for generations of unborn children. To David, there was no equation that made sense other than planting as many trees as possible, as quickly as possible. The Family Feud opportunity had come through his sister Jenny, who worked in marketing and worried about David's isolation from normal social connections. She had applied hoping that television exposure might attract supporters who could help him expand his impact. David's parents, Dr. Michael and Dr. Susan Kim, both physicians who had immigrated from South Korea, had mixed feelings about their son's choices. They were proud of his environmental commitment, but worried that he was sacrificing financial security and personal relationships for a cause that might be too big for one person to meaningfully impact. The preparation for Family Feud had been challenging for David, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his mind was always calculating environmental impact. When his family practiced survey questions about what people do for fun, David answered plant trees. His answers were always technically correct, but they reflected a worldview that prioritized long-term environmental sustainability over short-term human pleasures. The morning of their taping, David had still insisted on his usual routine. While most contestants might spend the morning relaxing, David had been in Fairmount Park at dawn, planting 5 more trees before heading to New York. Trees, number 49,848 through 49,852. He couldn't break his routine when there was still work to be done. The train ride to New York had been filled with David's usual activity, researching potential planting sites and corresponding with environmental organizations via his phone. His sister Jenny had tried to get him to practice game show answers, but David's mind was focused on larger questions. How many trees could be planted with Family Feud prize money? How could television exposure inspire others to take environmental action? Steve Harvey's pre-show meeting with the Kim family was immediately different from typical contestant interactions. When he met David, whose hands were still stained from that morning's planting session, Steve found himself talking with someone whose entire life was organized around environmental mission. "David," Steve said, Your family tells me you've planted almost 50,000 trees in 10 years. That's incredible, but why trees? What got you started? David's response carried the urgency of someone who had spent a decade watching climate data worsen while feeling like most people weren't taking proportional action. I'm a science teacher, Steve. I spend every day teaching kids about climate change, and I see the fear in their eyes when they realize what kind of world they're inheriting. Rising temperatures, extreme weather, species extinction, these aren't distant problems. They're happening now. He paused, his intensity building. I couldn't keep teaching kids about environmental problems without doing something meaningful to address them. Trees are one of the most effective carbon capture technologies we have. Every tree I plant today will be cleaning the air that a child breathes 50 years from now. Steve was struck by David's passion and precision in discussing environmental impact. 50,000 trees, that's a massive commitment. How do you afford it? How do you find the time? David's answer revealed his personal sacrifice. I live on 20% of my teacher's salary and donate the rest to tree planting initiatives. I spend every weekend and every free hour planting trees. Most people think I'm crazy for giving up vacations and financial security for trees. Amy Jockett, but I think we're crazy if we don't take action when we know what's at stake. The opposing family, the Martinez family from Texas, had initially approached the competition with enthusiasm, but when they learned about David's environmental mission and witnessed his absolute dedication to climate action, their competitive energy transformed into respect and curiosity. When Steve Harvey took the stage, the studio buzzed with anticipation, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness. Recognition that this episode would be different because of the man at the contestants' podium, whose life had been completely restructured around environmental activism. The family introductions revealed the Kim family's values of education, service, and taking responsibility for problems beyond individual concerns. Steve learned about Dr. Michael and Dr. Susan Kim's journey from South Korea, about Jenny's work in marketing, and about David's choice to dedicate his career to combating climate change. David, Steve said during the introductions, 10 years, almost 50,000 trees, 80% of your salary donated. What drives someone to make that level of commitment? David looked out at the studio audience and cameras, and his response carried the weight of a decade spent watching environmental conditions worsen while feeling like individual action was his only controllable response. The children in my classroom drive me, he said. Every day I teach kids about climate science, and I see them realize that adults are leaving them a damaged planet. I can't look those kids in the eye and tell them about environmental problems without doing everything in my power to be part of the solution. He continued with the passion of someone who had calculated the stakes and chosen action over comfort. 50,000 trees might not solve climate change, but they will absorb over 1 million pounds of carbon dioxide, produce enough oxygen for 1,200 people for a year, and create habitats for thousands of birds and animals. If everyone who could afford it planted even 100 trees, we could make a meaningful impact. The game began with David participating in the face-off. The question was, name something people do to help the environment. David buzzed in immediately and answered, plant trees. It was the #1 answer on the board, and the Kim family chose to play. As the round continued, each family member's answers reflected their understanding of environmental responsibility and sustainable living. Jenny answered recycle, which earned the #3 spot. Dr. Michael said reduce energy consumption, claiming the #4 position. Dr. Susan's answer of educate others about climate change wasn't on the board, but it drew sustained applause from the audience. When it was time for the third round, David was at the podium again. The category was name something people worry about for the future, and Steve approached him with obvious respect for the man who had spent a decade taking concrete action to address future environmental challenges. David, name something people worry about for the future. David thought about his students, about the children who would inherit whatever environmental conditions his generation left behind, about the species that were disappearing while humans debated policy responses to problems that science had already confirmed. Climate change, he said, with the certainty of someone who taught environmental science and who had spent 10 years trying to address the problem through direct action. It was the #2 answer on the board. and the studio audience applauded with unusual intensity. This wasn't just a game show response. This was acknowledgement of one of the most serious challenges facing humanity. But it was during the fourth round that the moment everyone would remember forever finally arrived. The category was Name Something Environmentalists Work Hardest to Protect, and after family members had provided answers like clean water, endangered species, and natural habitats, it was David's turn. Steve walked over to David's position at the podium, microphone in hand, and addressed the man who had restructured his entire life around environmental protection. David, environmentalists work hardest to protect what? David looked at Steve, then at his family, then at the studio audience filled with people who represented the current generation, making choices that would determine what kind of world future generations would inherit. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decade spent calculating environmental impact and the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out. "The air our children will breathe," he said. The words hung in the studio like a prayer, like a promise, like a challenge to everyone present. This wasn't just an answer about environmental protection. This was a statement about intergenerational responsibility, about the moral obligation to leave a livable planet for people not yet born. Steve Harvey, who had made his career entertaining families, found himself completely speechless. The studio fell silent as everyone present recognized they had just heard something that transcended game show entertainment and entered the realm of profound moral truth. "The air our children will breathe," Steve repeated slowly, and then louder, "the air our children will breathe." He set his microphone down and walked directly to where David stood. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in the studio understood that they were witnessing something that went beyond television. "David," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "in all my years of hosting this show, I have never heard an answer that was more important, more urgent, or more true than what you just said." He positioned himself directly in front of David, speaking with the respect of someone recognizing genuine heroism. "You know what you just did? You reminded everyone in this studio, everyone watching at home, that environmental protection isn't about polar bears or rainforests or abstract future problems. It's about the air that our children, our actual children, are going to breathe. It's about whether the world we leave them will be livable." Steve turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying unusual gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man right here has planted almost 50,000 trees. 50,000. While most of us are complaining about environmental problems, David Kim has spent 10 years getting up every morning and actually solving them, one tree at a time. He's given up vacations, financial security, and personal comfort because he believes that someone has to take responsibility for the future." The studio audience rose to their feet in spontaneous applause, but Steve wasn't finished. But that's not even the most incredible part. The most incredible part is why he does it. Not for recognition, not for profit, not for fame. He does it because he teaches children every day, and he refuses to look those children in the eye while doing nothing about the environmental crisis they're inheriting. Steve walked back to David, who was standing quietly with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the recognition of a mission he had pursued largely alone for a decade. "David, I want you to have something special." Steve asked the production team to bring out something that had been prepared based on information the Kim family had shared, a small potted tree sapling, along with a certificate dedicating a tree planting in David's name. "This is a sapling that will be planted in Central Park as part of the city's urban reforestation program," Steve explained. "But more than that, this represents something important. You've shown all of us that environmental protection isn't someone else's job. It's not something we wait for governments or corporations to handle. It's something each of us can do, starting today." Steve turned to address the studio audience directly. "How many of you here have ever planted a tree? How many of you have ever thought about the air your children will breathe 50 years from now?" He paused, letting the question sink in. David Kim has planted 50,000 trees because he calculated that 50,000 trees will absorb over 1 million pounds of carbon dioxide and produce enough oxygen for 1,200 people. But more than that, he's planted 50,000 trees because he believes that every action matters, that every tree matters, that every person has a responsibility to be part of the solution. The studio erupted in sustained applause, but it wasn't just applause. It was recognition, commitment, and resolve from people who had been reminded that environmental problems require individual action, not just policy solutions. Steve walked back to David and handed him the sapling. "David, you keep planting trees, and the rest of us are going to start following your example, because the air our children breathe is too important to leave to someone else." The episode aired 3 weeks later and became a cultural phenomenon that extended beyond typical game show entertainment. David's story sparked national conversation about individual environmental action, personal sacrifice for collective benefit, and the moral obligation to address climate change through concrete action rather than just concern. The response from viewers was unprecedented. Environmental organizations reported massive increases in volunteers and donations. Tree nurseries reported overwhelming demand for saplings. Schools began organizing tree planting events, and social media was filled with photos of families planting trees. But perhaps most significantly, the 50,000 Trees Challenge became a viral movement, with people committing to plant specific numbers of trees and sharing their progress online. Within 6 months, the challenge had resulted in over 200,000 trees being planted by families inspired by David's story. Steve Harvey, who had built his career on family entertainment, learned something profound about the power of individual commitment to create systemic change. In interviews afterward, he said, "David taught me that environmental protection isn't about waiting for perfect solutions. It's about looking at your children and deciding that their future is worth whatever sacrifice you have to make today." David used his portion of the family's winnings to purchase land for a permanent tree preserve and to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing environmental science education. But the real prize was recognition that individual environmental action matters, that personal sacrifice can create collective benefit, and that someone willing to plant 50,000 trees can inspire millions to reconsider their environmental choices. David Kim continues to plant trees every morning before school, continues to live on 20% of his salary, and recently achieved his goal of 50,000 trees planted. His next goal is 75,000 trees by his 42nd birthday, because the calculations remain the same. Every tree matters, every action has consequences, and someone has to take responsibility for the air that future children will breathe. Because sometimes the future really is planted, one seed at a time, by hands that will never rest in the shade they create, and sometimes a science teacher with soil under his fingernails can remind an entire television studio that environmental heroism isn't about having all the answers. It's about taking action with whatever resources you have, one tree at a time, until the world becomes livable for the children who will inherit whatever we leave behind.